The war had lasted so long that even the stars seemed dimmer in its wake. Across the fractured systems of the galactic core, the Zeyvanii ascendancy and the Va'resh dominion waged a conflict that neither could remember the beginning of, nor see an end to. Empires had risen and fallen in the span of their war, civilizations reduced to memory, yet the fighting never ceased. It had become an institution, a ritual of blood and fire passed down through the ages, so deeply entrenched in the identities of both species that peace had long since become an absurdity. Then, humanity arrived. A minor species by galactic standards, late to the stars, fragile in body but vexingly resilient in mind. Unlike the empires of old, humanity did not conquer or submit. It traded, it adapted, it spread like wildfire across the neutral zones, observing, learning, and, most disturbingly, questioning. When the Galactic Council, an ancient and largely impotent governing body, called for yet another peace summit, the Ascendancy and the Dominion prepared for another futile round of negotiations. That was, until the Council introduced an unfamiliar name, Ambassador Elias Vaughn. The human was an anomaly, a seasoned diplomat, renowned for unconventional strategies and a disarming demeanor. He had been chosen not because humanity wielded great power, but because it wielded something far more dangerous, an outside perspective. He was neither Zeyvanii nor Va'resh. He held no ancestral grudges, no blood-stained traditions. He was a wild card in a war bound by repetition, and that made him the single most unpredictable force in the galaxy. The summit was held on Nol Tar, Prime, a neutral world scarred by the failures of past diplomacy. The council chamber, an opulent dome of silver and obsidian, bore the marks of previous negotiations, cracked marble from overturned tables, scorch marks from plasma exchanges, the faint scent of ionized air where assassins had tried and failed to silence compromise. Vaughn stepped into this battlefield of words with the measured ease of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to change. The Zeyvanii delegation, clad in ceremonial armor, their movements precise as a battle formation, regarded him with wary curiosity. The Va'resh, towering and predatory, observed with barely concealed disdain. Vaughn met their glares with an expression unreadable, his gaze sweeping across the room not with fear, but with calculation. They had seen thousands like him before. They had never seen one like him now. The opening exchanges followed tradition. Declarations of grievances, demands for surrender, recitations of ancient wrongs. Vaughn listened in silence, fingers steepled, absorbing each word, each implication. His face betrayed nothing. Then, as the cycle of rhetoric reached its predictable crescendo, he spoke. Why? A pause. A ripple of confusion, almost imperceptible, but Vaughn saw it. A brief flicker in the otherwise rehearsed performance. The Zeyvanii High Commander frowned. Why what, human? Why are you still fighting? Vaughn leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, voice steady, neither challenging nor placating. Not how it started. Not who struck first. Why, after 1,000 years, are you still at war? The chamber fell into uneasy silence. The Zeyvanii and Va'resh had answered that question 1,000 times before, and yet, in this moment, no answer seemed sufficient. Vaughn did not press. He let the silence stretch, an invisible vice tightening around the room. Then, the High Commander spoke. Because they will never stop, he said, his voice measured but edged with conviction. Because to stop is to invite destruction. They would see our kind eradicated if we faltered. The Va'resh warlord scoffed. As you would do to us were the positions reversed. Vaughn exhaled softly, shaking his head. So neither of you can stop because stopping means death. He looked at them both, something almost amused flickering in his eyes. Tell me, when did this war end? Because I think you missed it. Another silence, this one heavier, more uncertain. Vaughn leaned back, watching the weight of his words settle. He had come here not to dictate peace, not to convince them of its merits, but to plant a seed, one that, if left to grow, would unravel the very foundation of their war. And unbeknownst to either side, the war was already beginning to unravel. The silence stretched across the chamber like a blade held at the throat of history. Vaughn had seen this before. Not in war councils, but in boardrooms and back alleys. In the moments before an empire blinked and a dynasty crumbled. Silence was more dangerous than any weapon because it meant they were thinking. The Zeyvanii High Commander broke first. His golden-plated gauntlet tapped against the table, his nostrils flaring with barely restrained frustration. You speak in riddles, human. The war has never ended. The war will never end. Vaughn smiled just slightly. You don't believe that. The warlord's nostrils flared, but he did not refute it. Vaughn turned his gaze to the High Commander. You came to this table because you are losing something more valuable than planets. You are losing time. 1,000 years of war, and what has it brought you? New worlds? No. Strength? Hardly. The honor of your people? Vaughn's voice dropped just slightly. His words weighted with something more dangerous than accusation. Certainty. Your people are tired. The Zeyvanii's fingers curled into a fist. They would never, and they would. Vaughn cut in, his voice iron. They have. His fingers danced across the hollow projector built into the table's edge, and the room darkened as images filled the air. Star maps, economic reports, declassified warfront footage, fields of unburied dead, husks of once thriving colonies abandoned, planets cracked in two by the sheer weight of perpetual battle. I had my people do some digging. You've lost more resources than you've gained. Your colonies are on the brink of collapse. The new generation, those who were raised in war, but did not start it, are questioning why their fathers still fight. And the Va'resh? Vaughn turned, shifting the weight of his argument like a blade finding its target. You've been retreating. Small increments, barely noticeable unless someone's been tracking it for years. You call it tactical withdrawal, but I call it what it is: exhaustion. A ripple of unease traveled through the room. Vaughn let the silence settle before he continued. This war has momentum, 1,000 years of momentum, but momentum is not the same as purpose. And if you keep moving forward without purpose, you will fall. The Zeyvanii High Commander exhaled sharply. Then what would you suggest? Vaughn smiled, the slow, knowing smile of a gambler who already saw the cards about to be played. That depends. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now, but no less dangerous. On whether you want to win, or if you want to survive. The warlord's eyes narrowed. Explain. Vaughn tilted his head, pretending to consider. You assume that peace is surrender, that stopping the war is an admission of weakness. But let me ask you this. If your people wake up tomorrow and realize they don't need to fight anymore, what happens to you? The warlord's claws tapped against the metal of his chair. The High Commander said nothing. You don't fear peace because you think the enemy will take advantage of it. Vaughn's voice turned quiet, deadly. You fear peace because it means you're no longer needed. The words struck like a hammer. The Zeyvanii High Commander stiffened. The Va'resh warlord bared his teeth, but Vaughn saw the flicker of realization behind his predatory glare. The war had sustained them. It had defined them. To end it was not simply to end a conflict. It was to strip them of their purpose. Vaughn exhaled, sitting back in his chair. You don't need me to negotiate peace. Peace is inevitable. The question isn't whether the war ends. It's whether you decide to be the ones who end it, or if history does it for you. The weight of his words hung between them. For the first time in 1,000 years, silence did not mean war. It meant uncertainty. And uncertainty was the first step to something they had never dared to consider: a future beyond the war. The silence that followed Vaughn's words was not the heavy finality of dismissal, nor the charged anticipation of an imminent battle. It was something else, something far more dangerous. It was consideration. The Zeyvanii High Commander's jaw tightened, the weight of Vaughn's revelation settling into the spaces between his ribs like cold iron. He was not a man easily shaken, not after centuries of conflict, of leading legions into wars he had been born to fight. But something in the human's tone, The quiet certainty, the audacity of his conviction, struck deeper than any blade. The Va'resh warlord exhaled slowly, a flick of his clawed fingers dismissing his entourage's quiet murmurs of protest. His gaze, sharp as razors and twice as deadly, lingered on Vaughn. "You speak as if the war is already over." Vaughn didn't blink. "It is. You just haven't realized it yet." The warlord bared his teeth, more in thought than aggression. "Then why does it continue?" Vaughn leaned forward, fingers tracing slow circles against the cold surface of the negotiation table. "Because it's easier to keep killing than to admit you've been doing it for nothing." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the assembled commanders. The Va'resh delegation exchanged unreadable glances, their rigid postures betraying the first flickers of doubt. The Zeyvanii High Commander's voice was carefully measured when he spoke again. "We cannot simply stop." Vaughn tilted his head slightly, waiting. The commander's grip tightened on the edges of the table. "We have sacrificed too much. Too many sons, too many daughters. If we end this war with nothing, then what have they died for?" Vaughn's expression softened, just barely. "Then don't end it with nothing." A pause. The warlord's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Vaughn exhaled, his voice steady. "You want peace? Then make the end of this war mean something. Rewrite the terms of the battle, not in blood, but in history. If this conflict is all you've known, then reshape it into something new. Make the war end on your terms, not in surrender, not in retreat, but in evolution." The Zeyvanii commander frowned. "That is not how war works, human." "Maybe not," Vaughn admitted. "But it's how civilizations survive." Another ripple of silence. The Va'resh warlord, ever the pragmatist, leaned back, watching Vaughn with something between skepticism and reluctant curiosity. "You think you can rewrite 1,000 years of war with words?" Vaughn gave him a slow, knowing smile. "I think I already have." The room shifted. The tone of the negotiations, the very air itself, became something more unstable, more volatile, not with hostility, but with the weight of something unfamiliar. Possibility. As if summoned by the very thought, the room exploded into chaos. A sudden shockwave of energy rattled the chamber doors, the security fields flickering under the force of an external detonation. The room plunged into emergency lighting, crimson-red alarms flaring across the walls. The Va'resh warlord was on his feet first, a plasma dagger in one hand, his security detail immediately forming a defensive line. The Zeyvanii commander was only a second slower, barking orders in a sharp, clipped tone as his guards activated their kinetic shields. "Vaughn?" Vaughn just sighed. He had been expecting this. Before he could say a word, the reinforced chamber doors buckled inward with a shriek of tortured metal. Smoke and debris spilled into the room as figures in unmarked combat armor stormed through, weapons raised. The war profiteers. Vaughn barely had time to roll his eyes before the first shot was fired. A plasma bolt seared across the room, cutting through the air where the Zeyvanii commander had stood just a moment before. He had moved fast, faster than Vaughn had expected, drawing a ceremonial blade in one hand while seizing a fallen energy rifle in the other. The Va'resh warlord, meanwhile, was already engaged, tearing through the attackers like a force of nature. Claws ripped through armor, his plasma blade cutting through the darkness like a dying star. Vaughn did what humans did best. He improvised. Diving low, he grabbed one of the fallen soldier's sidearms, flipping it in his grip. He wasn't a soldier. Not really. But he had spent enough time around them to know how to aim and pull the damn trigger. He fired twice. A staggering blast knocked one of the attackers back, their armor cracking under the impact. The second shot went wide, but that was fine. It wasn't meant to hit. It was meant to distract. The Zeyvanii commander exploited the opening immediately, driving his blade into the exposed weak point of the nearest attacker's armor. The Va'resh warlord finished the job with a brutal, efficient strike, and within moments the assassins were dead. The chamber fell into silence once more, this time heavy with something Vaughn recognized all too well. Realization. The Zeyvanii. Commander wiped blood from his blade, his voice as sharp as the weapon in his hand. Who sent them? The Va'resh warlord exhaled, flicking his blade clean. The ones who don't want peace. Vaughn pushed himself to his feet, dusting off his jacket. Well, that narrows it down to about half the galaxy. The Zeyvanii commander turned toward him, eyes dark. You knew this would happen. Vaughn gave him a wry smile. Of course I did. The warlord's growl was low, dangerous. Then, why not warn us? Vaughn exhaled, looking around the room at the wreckage, the bodies, the undeniable proof that peace was no longer just an option. It was a necessity. Because you wouldn't have believed me, he said simply. The room fell, silent once more. But it was no longer the silence of war, nor the silence of hesitation. It was the silence of change. And that, Vaughn knew, was the most dangerous silence of all. The scent of burning ozone still clung to the air, mingling with the faint, acrid stench of cauterized flesh. The chamber was silent, save for the distant echoes of alarms reverberating through the corridors, beyond. The assassins lay motionless, their mission a failure, but their intent had been made painfully clear. Vaughn exhaled slowly, turning to face the gathered delegations. The Zeyvanii commander stood with his ceremonial blade still slick with blood, his gaze unreadable. The Va'resh warlord, his chest still rising and falling in deep measured breaths, regarded Vaughn with something between wariness and newfound respect. This was it. The moment where everything tipped. Vaughn stepped forward, carefully placing his hands on the war table between them. I assume, he said, his voice even, that we can all agree this war has officially gone on too. The High Commander's hands clenched into fists. Then let us find them. Burn them from existence. Vaughn let out a sharp breath. And then what? The Zeyvanii narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? You burn them. You destroy the profiteers. You erase them from history. Vaughn's gaze did not waver. And then what? Do you return to fighting each other? Do you turn your fleets around and pretend none of this ever happened? Or do you do the one thing they never expected? The room was deathly quiet. The Va'resh warlord's eyes gleamed with something dangerously close to intrigue. And what? Is that human? Vaughn straightened. You changed the rules of the game. The High Commander scoffed. You think we can rewrite 1,000 years of war with words? Vaughn's lips twitched. No. But I think you can weaponize the truth. The Va'resh warlord folded his arms. Explain. Vaughn took a slow breath. For 1,000 years, this war has been fought in the open. It has been brutal, relentless. You have thrown armies at each other, razed worlds, shattered fleets. He exhaled. But if this war is no longer between your people, if it has been manipulated, prolonged by unseen hands, then what you need now is not another battlefield. His eyes gleamed with something dangerous. What you need is a reckoning. The High Commander stiffened. The warlord's claws curled against his palms. Use your war machine against them, Vaughn pressed. You have spent centuries perfecting warfare. Now apply it where it matters. Investigate. Hunt them down. Expose them. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Because nothing is more powerful than an empire turning its weapons inward. The Zeyvanii's expression was unreadable. And what if you are wrong? Vaughn held his gaze. Then prove it. The room shifted. Something ancient, something unbreakable in the hearts of these warriors was fracturing, not in weakness, but in transformation. For the first time in 1,000 years, they were no longer looking at each other as enemies. They were looking outward. The warlord let out a slow exhale, something dark and calculating in his expression. If what you say is true, then this war is not between us. The High Commander, after a long silence, nodded. And if that is the case, then we have been nothing but pawns. Vaughn's fingers drummed against the war table. So what are you going to do about it? The Zeyvanii and Va'resh exchanged glances. Then the High Commander spoke the words that ended a 1,000-year war. The enemy is no longer across this table. The enemy is the war itself. And just like that, the war was over. The ramifications of that single sentence rippled outward like a shockwave. The war councils collapsed overnight. Generals and admirals, once locked in endless battle, turned their focus inward. Fleets that had been poised to strike at each other instead began a new campaign. A hunt for those who had profited from their endless suffering. War profiteers, intelligence operatives, shadowed political figures, all those who had thrived, in the chaos found themselves being dragged into the light. The Galactic Council was forced to acknowledge what they had long ignored. The war had never been about righteousness or survival. It had been a construct perpetuated for reasons that had long since lost meaning to those who fought it. And Vaughn? Vaughn simply stepped back, watching as history rewrote itself in real time. The war had not ended in victory. It had ended in understanding, and, that was far more dangerous. The war had not ended with fire and blood, nor with surrender or treaties inked in desperation. It had ended with a realization, a truth so profound, so undeniable, that it shattered centuries of tradition in a single breath. The Zeyvanii and Va'resh did not declare peace in the old ways of the galaxy. There were no triumphant celebrations, no grandiose pronouncements. There was only the weight of change, heavy as a dying star pressing down upon the war-weary shoulders of both empires. The fleets, once poised to obliterate each other at the slightest provocation, held their positions in eerie silence. Soldiers who had been trained from birth to despise their enemies now turned their weapons inward, not upon their own people, but toward the shadows that had fed the war like carrion birds picking at the bones of the dead. Vaughn stood at the edge of the negotiation chamber, watching as the Zeyvanii High Commander and the Va'resh warlord communicated in hushed, measured tones. It was a sight that would have been unthinkable mere hours ago, an exchange devoid of hatred, without the simmering contempt that had poisoned every interaction before. The war wasn't truly over yet. It would take years, decades perhaps, for the wounds to close, for the borders to be redrawn and trust to be rebuilt. But the decision had been made, and that was more powerful than any treaty. The High Commander turned to Vaughn. "You realize what you've done?" It was not a question. "Baozu." The war had ended in a way no one had predicted, not with conquest, not with surrender, but with understanding. It did not end cleanly. There were no grand celebrations, no parades through the core worlds. The soldiers did not throw down their weapons in relief. Instead, they turned those weapons inward, redirecting their focus toward the shadows that had fed their hatred for centuries. For many, it was not an easy transition. Some Zeyvanii generals refused to accept peace, retreating to the fringes of known space to wage a futile resistance. Some Va'resh warlords, robbed of their purpose, turned mercenary, seeking new conflicts to fill the void. But the war itself, the great machine that had consumed entire civilizations, it was dead. The galaxy was left to pick up the pieces, to forge something new from the ashes of a millennium of destruction. And in the midst of it all, humanity stood apart, observers of a history they had helped rewrite. Vaughn watched it unfold from a distance. He had refused all offers of power, all seats at the tables of new governance. He had seen what happened to men who won wars and then tried to rule. That was not his path. Instead, he sat on the balcony of a small outpost world, a drink in one hand, his communicator in the other, reading and rereading the message that had arrived just before he left the war's final battlefield. "We need you for another negotiation. This time it's even bigger." The words lingered in his mind. The Zeyvanii and Va'resh war had been one conflict in a galaxy full of them. If there were forces powerful enough to manipulate an interstellar war for 1,000 years, then what else was happening beyond the borders of human knowledge? Who else was watching? Vaughn exhaled, setting the communicator down. The stars stretched out before him, a universe full of secrets, full of conflicts waiting to be unraveled, full of truths waiting to be spoken. He knew what would come next. He would finish his drink. He would sit in the silence for a little while longer, and then when the moment felt right, he would answer the call.